The final panel for the afternoon is going to take up the question of politics, of labor policy, social policy, from a range of perspectives. And I'm very pleased to have, as the chair of this panel, my dear friend and colleague, Peniel Joseph. So, Peniel, why don't you take it over?
Okay, great. Thank you, Jamie. Very excited about this panel on labor, social movements, and the politics of a New Deal. We have a very esteemed panel, a set of 5 panelists who I'll introduce in the order they are going to be speaking. We'll just go down the line this way, starting with John. John Judas is author of The Nationalist Revival and editor-at-large Talking Points Memo, and we all love TPM, so that's great. We've got the esteemed Harold Meyerson, who's editor-at-large of the American Prospect, one of the august journals of our time. We've got Qian-Yi Lu, Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica?
Yeah.
Taipei, Taiwan, with us. We have Sebastian Dullien, Hans-Boeckler Institute, Germany. And finally, Damon A. Silver's Policy Director and Special Counsel, AFL-CIO. And we will start with...
Why don't you encourage these people to move down? It's like we're crazy.
Yeah, we're not infectious.
Okay, so we'll say, can everybody come down and just have we can have a more intimate space and conversation with one another?
Yeah, yeah. We have infectious wit, but we're
We're
not
all talking about
actually
social movements and
infectious.
political transformation. So we're all very empathetic revolutionaries down here, and we want people closer. That's great. Michael, I love it. Very esteemed Michael Lind is with us too. Hey, Raj, I see Raj Patel
Okay.
here. Look at that.
Well, we'll let
Okay.
those other 2 people come down here. I have an invisible PowerPoint presentation, so you won't have to squint. I'm supposed to talk on something about labor and politics. I'm going to talk mainly about politics. I'm not a climate scientist, to say the least. I come out of the left in America, SDS in the 60s, and that's relevant, as you'll see. I'm going to come back to that toward the end of my talk. Let me just start by comparing the 60s to the last decade that we're going through. If you look at the 60s, most people think SDS, Black Panther Party, SNCC, they think of the left as a period of the new left. But in fact, it was a period when the right emerged as a major force. Ronald Reagan, John Tower, Barry Goldwater, Young Americans for Freedom. And you know, by 1980, the country was in the hands of the right and not of the left. Now, if you look at this last decade that we've gone through, it's the opposite. I mean, it's starting in 2009 or so, Tea Party in March of 2009, culminating in the election of Donald Trump. Period of the right, period when the populist right emerges. But it's also, again, and this is the reverse, a period where there has been a very strong current of the left. Start with Occupy Wall Street, up through the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, and Sanders and Warren in 2020. The Democratic Socialists of America, that I was a member of one of the parent organizations, the New American Movement, and Harold is a longtime member of DSA. I mean, you know, it had like about 14 active members about 10 years ago, and now it has 60,000 and over 100 state legislators. So, you know, something is happening in this country on the left, and that's really what I want to talk about and assess and talk about a little about what its prospects are. First of all, who are these people? Who are these people now who are on the left? And I want to give you 3 characteristics, and this is not going to be inclusive. You're going to be able to name 14 counterexamples that you know, but I think this gets at the bulk of them. First of all, they're young people. I don't know with these generations, what, Z, X, whatever, you know, age 16 through about 40 now, the late 30s. If you looked at the 18 to 29-year-old vote in 2016, Bernie Sanders won more than Trump and Clinton combined. He would have been the next president if that's the only people who voted. Corbyn in 2017, again, he would have been the prime minister rather than Theresa May. France, Mélenchon, he would have been in the runoff. I don't even know with who, but probably with Macron, but maybe with Le Pen, if only the 18 to 29 vote counted. So a lot of these people, a lot of the vote is concentrated among young people. Second characteristic of these young people is they're members of what we used to in the late 60s, when I used to edit a journal called Socialist Revolution, called the New Working Class. We used to talk about the diversified proletariat. College educated, knowledge industry, engaged in the production of goods and services, but by a criterion that's not simply by a bottom line. So not the same as sales, not the same as management. A teacher, the goal is to educate. A doctor, a nurse, it's to heal. And that's the objective. So there's an enormous number of people now who are in this group, and they range from, in the census, from technicians to professionals. And that's where a lot of the left is concentrated. That's where it comes from. These are people, again, who are engaged in goods and service production where the idea is a certain kind of excellence, but where they're increasingly subject to what they can see as arbitrary authority. We used to call it in the 60s proletarianization, but that's the process. Again, nurses, doctors, subject to the whims of hospital administrators, insurance companies. That's the kind of thinking. They're coming into a capitalism that is changing very rapidly under the influence of automation. It could be changing even more rapidly in the future, where their own futures are to some extent insecure. So again, put those two together. Those are the first 2 characteristics. And I sometimes hear people say, well, how can a group like this, that it tends to be better paid, that tends to have more responsibility and authority, be the leaders of the left? But if you think again about the history of the left over the last 200 years, it was the labor aristocracy. That was the group that led this. Social Democrats in the late 19th century, the German Social Democrats. Group again, Socialist Party in America. Group again, the Labour Party in Britain. It was the upper tier. So again, there's nothing unusual about that. It's nothing weird about it. The third characteristic of this group is that it's inordinately concentrated in these kind of big cities and college towns that specialize partly in what Peter Temin calls the FTE, finance, technology, and electronics, but also high-level education and healthcare. Like Dartmouth is also Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital Center, which serves an enormous amount of Vermont and New Hampshire. Those kinds of areas in the country. And you wouldn't so much find the left in Muncie, Indiana. You wouldn't find it in Erie, Pennsylvania. You wouldn't, in other words, find it in these towns that don't have the same kind of industry, post-industrial economy. In many of those places, like the towns in North Carolina that used to have a very prosperous furniture industry, a lot of the young people have left. And those were the towns, incidentally, that went for Trump in North Carolina and helped him carry the state in 2016. So again, think of these three characteristics: youth, new working class, concentrated in these big metro areas, or you could use the example too of the Ann Arbor, Oberlin, smaller towns, but towns that have major educational institutions. Now, let me first talk about the limits that this kind of left has, and then let me talk about what are its positive prospects. So negative.
We've got
first,
two
then
minutes.
Huh?
If we're staying on time, 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yeah, because everybody's getting 10 minutes, and then we're going to do Q&A.
I'll do 4. I'll try to zip through this. The first thing I want to say is that and this again goes back to my experience in the New Left and the disintegration of the New Left in the early 1970s, is that because of its cultural and social isolation within the country, in other words, you hear these things about flyover country versus the coast, but again, it's Chicago, places like that are not flyover country. You have a certain cultural and social insularity that characterizes the left. And it's an insularity that even has a religious component. A few very quick examples. In AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in her campaign, which was used as a kind of model. If you look at her three major demands on the board, one of them was health care for all, the other one was full employment, and the other one was support LGBTQIA+. Now, I venture to say that not 0.5% in her district could tell you what those initials stood for. Again, a certain kind of cultural insularity there. Green New Deal, yeah, fine, we have to do something. But again, there's a sense that the planet is going to be destroyed. I heard Elizabeth Warren talk about that. If we don't do anything now, the planet is going to be destroyed. There's a kind of, do you know the Millerites from the 1840s? They thought the world was going to end in 1843. There's again a kind of religious sense of impending doom and Armageddon that infects the proponents of the Green New Deal, what have you. Reparations, again, a demand that many Americans, the great majority of Americans came here, their ancestors came after the Civil War, simply don't understand, they don't get it. But these are, again, have become central parts of the message of the left, and they're very limiting. And they're limiting in the same way that we found in the early 70s the message of the New Left was limiting. It was going to confine us to a kind of social minority in the country. One final thing, what are the positive things? First of all, demography, the country is changing in a post-industrial direction demographically. So again, a lot of the people that we're talking about are going to become a larger and larger number of the country. And there's no sign, again, that the young are changing. This used to thing is socialist when you're young and conservative when you're old. That does not seem to be happening to these generations. Second thing, capitalism itself, not just climate change, inequality, the insecurity bred of that, encourages big government. It encourages the growth of the public sector. And the question that we're going to be faced with really is whether the solution to that will be some kind of authoritarian government that will exclude certain parts of the population, or whether it'll be a democracy. And whether it will be or not, a lot of it will depend upon whether we have forces from below, unions, civic organizations that are pushing upwards and make this new development of the left something that's democratic. So that's my
Thank you.
Well, John's slideshow works so well, I'm going to use it too. Last week, the mayor of Pittsburgh, Bill Peduto, a generally progressive Democrat, suggested that his state, Pennsylvania, ban fracking, which is something that is somewhat widespread in Pennsylvania. They have the Marcellus Shale. This seemed to be okay within the city limits of Pittsburgh, but the moment you stepped outside of the city limits, it began to get pushback. So much so that Allegheny County, in which Pittsburgh is the central city, but there's more to it than that, that Peduto's chief ally, who was the head of the Allegheny County Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Fitzgerald, who is generally joined at the hip with Peduto, said, in essence, what are you, nuts? This got a lot of pushback from labor. The Allegheny County Central Labor Council, that is to say the AFL-CIO there, immediately condemned Peduto's statement. But it's interesting to see who was where on this. This was chiefly the building trades. They've got some major projects in construction outside Pittsburgh. But there was a certain silence from most of the unions within Pittsburgh. Most notably, the union that is identified with what is Pittsburgh's historic identity as the steel capital of the United States, once the steel capital of the world, that is to say the United Steelworkers. Now, the United Steelworkers aren't just steelworkers. They contain a group that merged into them some time ago, the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. So if you're talking fossil fuel workers in the United States, these are the folks who are working in refineries and what have you. So core fossil fuel, but not a word out of the United Steelworkers, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh. I was looking around for why this was. There are some historic reasons, but I think the major reason is this. The old CIO unions don't organize or can't organize what's left of their founding industries. And so like the United Auto Workers, which has a hell of a time, if you follow this, organizing auto workers these days, but has unionized a bunch of graduate students in colleges and some faculty. So the steelworkers are in the midst of they filed for an election at the University of Pittsburgh. 5,000 possible members, both tenured faculty, non-tenured faculty, adjunct faculty, graduate students. What do you think those folks think about fracking? Let me just assume that they hate it. This would be the biggest increase in membership the United Steelworkers has received in a long time. So to the United Auto Workers and some Ivy League colleges and University of California. The building trades are organized on a different basis and have not expanded to what is the survival technique for some American unions, which is, look, as John Judas just said, young people are for unions. Actually, the popularity of unions at 65% in the latest Gallup poll is 10 times the percentage of private sector workers actually in unions, 6.5%. There's a clash here. So who are the potential enemies of a Green New Deal in the United States? Okay, the fossil fuel industry is a given. The actually existing Republican Party is a given. And then you get to blue-collar workers of all races. And, you know, these are folks who are up for grabs, and if their jobs, they consider their jobs to be imperiled by this kind of transition, they're more than up for grabs. They are skeptical, opposed, angry. You know, in the second panel this morning, David talked about, well, you've got all these separate parties in Europe, so they're not coming together, not the Greens with the Social Democrats, to figure out a joint Green New Deal program. But here, at least, we have the Democratic Party. Boy, oh boy, the Democratic Party. When I was 18 years old, I was at, as was Jamie, at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And if we're talking about the historic New Deal, if you want to sort of set a date to when the New Deal coalition definitively fell apart, it might be that convention. Now, the ostensible fight was the Vietnam War. Understood. And I was a young guy, very young guy, I was 18, on the Gene McCarthy anti-war presidential campaign. But no one who was in Chicago that week thought this was confined to that ostensible fight, that one issue. These were two different groups of people. Somewhat, as John said, I would say it's not just, you know, the left culture that's isolated. America is home to many different cultures, some of which don't permeate other cultures very much. And what we saw in Chicago that week was this young left and some of working class Chicago, some of the Chicago Police Department, which then as now leaves a lot to be desired, going at it hammer and tongs just for who the hell you were and what values presumably you personified. My fear is that we may, within the hypothetical at least, Democratic coalition of 2019 and 2020, see similar divisions between some of these blue-collar workers and a Green New Deal movement which has the public face in this country, and it somewhat is reflective of its wider composition, that is young, that is highly educated, much of what John described it as, and that the differences here are going to be difficult, refracted in all kinds of ways, including the ongoing democratic concern of can we win the upper post-industrial, still somewhat industrial Midwest, which has got a higher percentage of white working class members than other swing states. So part of what the Democrats, part of what we who support a Green New Deal need to be very cognizant of is the need to do two things. Explain in detail, and I think Damon may do some of this later on this panel, some of the jobs and jobs created by a Green New Deal, and be very, very clear about what a just transition for workers who will lose their jobs constitutes. I recently ran across and did a piece in my magazine about a just transition before the term had even been coined. In 1977, maybe the most stalwart left labor liberal member of the House of Representatives, Phil Burton from San Francisco, introduced legislation, which was then possible to enact because there was finally a Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, to expand the Redwood National Park in Northern California. Labor loved Burton. You know, he came up with all kinds of great programs for them, for welfare recipients, really a stellar member of Congress. When he proposed this, the Carpenters Union and the Loggers Union wanted his head. He would have thrown, this legislation would have thrown maybe 2,500 loggers out of work. Burton did a very smart thing. He hired a guy named Nat Weinberg, who had been sometimes referred to as Walter Reuther's brain trust. Nat was the chief economist and head of research for the United Auto Workers during the years when the United Auto Workers was really the one social democratic institution in American history that had real power. And Nat came up with what we consider a just transition. Okay, you're going to lose your job. We're going to give you, the federal government will give you 6 years, full pay, full benefits. If you're nearing retirement, 11 years, full pay, full benefits. They said, okay. And when the bill hit the floor of the House, the Sierra Club was lobbying for it, the Carpenters were lobbying for it, and the only people lobbying against it were the lobbyists for the Association of Chainsaw Manufacturers. The bill passed. Fast forward to this oil, chemical, and atomic workers, which is the union that is now part of the steelworkers, who had a brilliant education director, official there named Tony Mazzocchi, who coined the phrase just transition when there began to be some disasters at nuclear plants and things like that. And hey, if the workers are thrown out of work, we have to do something for them. You have to do a lot for them. Unionized refinery workers, at least in my old home state of California. They had the best paying blue-collar jobs there are, with the possible exception of longshore, $125,000 a year. Let me go for 2 more minutes. The building trades, but you can do a just transition there. And if we're talking on the scale of an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders Green New Deal plan, or even a Joe Biden Green New Deal plan, where you're talking $300 billion a year, for God's sakes, yes. There are, Bob Poland has figured out how many people there are in this industry. It's not that many, low 6 figures. You can handle that. Building trades are more complicated, more so because a number of the building trades are now aligned with the oil industry, the American petroleum industry. Some of those unions, laborers, basically is a pipeline laying union, and they don't see what the future jobs are, particularly in as much as came out in an earlier colloquy here, jobs like retrofitting really don't pay, even if you give them, you know, a $15 minimum wage, don't pay what a building tradesperson normally makes. So there has to be, as beginning with the plans of Jay Inslee when he was still a candidate, there has to be both insurance of things like what's called the project labor agreement, which means the work is going to be unionized in terms of building stuff related to a Green New Deal. And there has to be a lot of construction. The most striking slogan that a Democrat ran and won on in the 2018 midterm elections was that of Gretchen Whitmer, who was elected Democratic governor of Michigan, replacing a Republican predecessor. And her slogan was simply, "Fix the damn roads." It worked. She won. But it also addresses a broader issue, which is generally the underinvestment of both private and public capital in the United States, most particularly in isolated regions, which are the regions where we have what has been called deaths of despair, where there's been no investment. I think in conceptualizing politically what would make a Green New Deal work in the United States is the kind of infrastructure program of which this is a major component, but which specifies what the jobs are, as best as you can, what they pay. So that perhaps something like fix the damn roads, and while we're at it, save the planet, might be the way to go. Thank you.
I want to first thank James for inviting me. I feel really honored. I think it's a nice flow speaking after you because my presentation is informed by the same concern, the difficulty with between labor and the Green New Deal. I think the Green New Deal is categorically different from the old New Deal because there is a very inflexible and unforgiving deadline, which is going to be manifested in the form of the collapse of economic, collapse of the ecosystem, which is already beginning. And with that in mind, I think the greatest danger with the Green New Deal is that it does not get the chance of being implemented. So I think a lot of us have heard about it's from one of the yellow vest protesters who said that you worry about the end of the world. I have to worry about the end of the month. And also we hear Bernie Sanders talks about more Americans, I think more American workers, they live paycheck to paycheck. So there's a reason that this idea of just transition is not credible yet to many workers, and unionized or not, and even non-workers who do not feel that they can make any difference coming out to vote. So I think it's not a solution, but there's a likely place I urge the Green New Dealers to really try to look at it. I think has great potential. I think right now it's owned by the conservatives. It's the carbon fee and dividends. The more conservative or the more neoliberal version of this is promoted by Climate Leadership Coalition or Council, and it's initiated by James Baker and George Shultz, and it has all the big oils behind it. And so their idea is to have this carbon fee and dividend occupy the whole space of climate action and crowd out regulations and lawsuits. In the beginning, their quid pro quo is that if we have this, then no lawsuits against us. So I think this is something that the Green New Dealers should look at and maybe try to double down. I think the role of carbon fee and dividend is not in the future, is not in the package of the Green New Deal later on. It's for right now to try to sell the Green New Deal, because for the conservatives, they are somewhat using this idea, because carbon fee and dividend is a check to everybody. So right now in their plan, they begin with the fee of collecting the fee of something like $40 per ton. And that's very low. I think, I don't know about maybe economics or the campaigners, they need to figure out what the right numbers are. I've heard that to really make a difference, it has to be something like 200 or 300. So in that case, in the conservatives' case, they in their plan, beginning with $40 and then adding maybe $5 every year, a family of 4 will get a check of $2,000, something like that. I think progressives should really increase that rate and then make that check much fatter. And so maybe everybody can receive a check of, rather than a family, maybe everybody should receive a check of $2,000 or more. It's for them, for the conservatives, it's a trick. It's a quid pro quo. Somebody used hush money to describe the strategy. But I think that when it's used by the progressives, the nature is really very different. It's not hush money, it's not quid pro quo, it's not to crowd out other legitimate policies. It should be the right place, the right role for carbon fee and dividend is to help kickstart and to get the attention of the lower income or workers who are concerned about the next paycheck. This can help a little bit and enhance their confidence in supporting the Green New Deal. And I think most importantly is the progressives, after they catch the attention of lower income or workers, then need to directly communicate with them about the situation. I think right now, I think one way to look at that check, that dividend, is a form of campaign contribution. It just doesn't have to go through the candidates themselves. It is because right now the conservatives, they have somebody talked about it earlier, they have so much funding, they have so much campaign contribution. And the progressives can use this as one form of campaign contribution, and then it's a form of bypassing the control power of the neoliberals. So, and then have a dialogue with workers or voters. And I think it's important to have a conversation to point out that workers may think that the big oil or these fossil fuel jobs are protecting them, or big oils are protecting them, and conservatives are protecting them, protecting their jobs. It's exactly the other way around. workers, they are the kind of, in some degree, I think all of us, we are kind of the human shields protecting them, protecting the big oil, the conservatives. So maybe that conversation is necessary. And also, there is a less neoliberal version of carbon fee and dividend, and that's promoted by Citizens Climate Lobby, and James Hansen is behind, I think he's supporting it. And that version of carbon fee and dividend it's very, very detailed and very sophisticated. I think it'll be very useful for Green New Dealers to study and learn about. It has worked out all the details, even though for this version, the rate is also very low. It begins with $15 and only increase $10 every year. And it's important that in this version, they have advance payment, so that I think it's extra helpful to get the attention of the workers. And then for the worst hit areas for workers dependent on fossil fuel, it's also possible maybe to figure out a way for fees collected at a place to stay there and to distribute within that region. So otherwise, the benefit will be very diffused and the cost will be very high, concentrated for some people. And I think if the Green New Dealers can work on this, the conservatives will be very vulnerable. They'll not be able to attack the progressives for selling something that they themselves promote. And this is one of the dangers, I think. I think the support from labor is one of the dangers. The other very big danger for the Green New Deal is actually a trade agreement, especially the ones that are already in existence. For example, WTO is not the worst one. I'm going to talk about ISDS later, but just for WTO, there are already rulings that solar panels, they ruled that it's not, India cannot keep the jobs in India to, manufacture solar panels in India. So U.S. Took India to WTO, and India also took U.S. to WTO. And that's not the most dangerous threat. The other thing is ISDS. ISDS, many of you may know, it's already? Yes. ISDS is Investors State Dispute Settlement. It's very advanced protection mechanism to protect big oil. So a lot of the plans that are right now in the Green New Deal will not be legal because they can be brought into ISDS by tribunals, even job guarantee. My time is already up, or?
Yeah, I'm giving you another 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, thank you.
Half.
So ISDS, I think in the US, the most famous case would be the Keystone Pipeline. So if you want to turn from brown economy to green economy, some big oil companies' benefits, their profits will be hurt, then you'll be brought into ISDS tribunal. And the TransCanada, the company that was planning to build the pipeline, asked for 15 billion compensation if you don't build the pipeline for environmental reasons. And in France, the environment minister who resigned on a radio show. I think his big frustration was that when he tried to phase out fossil fuels, the plan was there, and then again, a company in Canada threatened to take, according to ISDS. So ISDS is very, very powerful, and it can just make the Green New Deal not work, not feasible. So I thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Well, thanks for the invitation, and I do have slides. Sorry for that, but there are some figures and some graphs which are more difficult if I just read the numbers to you. I'm going to talk about the politics and the discussion on a new Green Deal in Germany. Before I start with this, you should be aware that the Green or the New Deal is not a term which resonates very well in Germany, not because people are against it, but it's just not in our history. It doesn't matter. Soziale Marktwirtschaft does, but New Deal doesn't. So when we talk about these issues, we talk at the moment about investment programs, and this is what I'm going to refer to, or what I'm going to talk about. So I will discuss a little bit the underlying argument, where some of the main focus should be on such a Green New Deal for Germany, financing options and investment needs, and some emerging interesting political coalitions. I think this is a nice complement basically to what Peter did earlier, because there are some links, and I will provide some details where he came from a more macro European level. Why Green New Deal for Germany? We have a number of challenges. Decarbonisation is just one of them, and while we are not the United States and we're not burning that much fossil fuels, we are the manufacturing powerhouse of Europe, so we're building a lot of cars, we have tool builder industries, and we still have a bit of coal. But beyond that, we have a rundown infrastructure. Over the past 15 years or so, we had negative net public investment, so a shrinking capital stock. We have a challenging demography with a falling number of people in working age, and a lack of highly trained workers. And we have growing regional inequality, especially between the urban and rural areas, both perceived and real, and that has been fostering the populists, basically. And the second argument is that if you want to go green, this will only work if you take the people with you. And the populists are already using this argument, the elite against us, in the debate on basically phasing out coal, because, well, the elites live in the cities. That doesn't concern them, but the people who live in the coal mining areas. So if we talk about a Green New Deal in Germany, we would say this is a comprehensive strategy to modernize our economy for inclusive and sustainable growth. And in addition to decarbonization in Germany, the following elements are needed. Housing. We have a lack of housing, especially in the urban areas now. Green transport infrastructure, childcare, education, and communication networks. If you drive in some of our rural areas, you often don't have a mobile signal and you don't have data. And they don't have broadband access there, so there's no video streaming, but that's not the problem. But you also cannot do a lot of work if you don't have fast internet access. In addition, we just passed a climate package, or our government did. Peter discussed that. And the problem here is that most research shows that if you go into carbon pricing alone, it doesn't have much of an effect. What you need to do is you need to have complementary investments to increase the elasticity of the carbon price. So give the people, let's say, some district heating networks, and then you increase the carbon price. Then you save a lot of energy in heating. If you just increase the carbon price, it's just the households who have to pay up, and there isn't that much of an effect here. Now, the underlying problem in the German debate is that we have a constitutional clause introduced in 2009, which says the government can only have a deficit up to 0.35% of GDP. That's the federal government. The states are not allowed to have any deficit. This is very strict. That prohibits borrowing. And that is a problem in the debate. But at the moment, we are seeing some shifting political coalitions. The business sector is really fed up with the state of the infrastructure. 2/3 of the companies say that they are hindered in their business activities by the bad infrastructure. And therefore, the Employers Federation, or the Industry Federation, has come out and has called for a large-scale investment program. And my institute, which is close to the unions, at the moment we are working together with the institute from the Industry Federation. And next week, Monday, there's no German journalist in here, we are going to present a big study demanding 450 billion in investment over the coming 10 years, financed by new debt. And it will be the head of the Trade Unions Federation together with the head of the Industry Federation, which are going to present this study in our big national press conference. So, and we hope that something is moving there, and this goes a little bit into the direction what Peter said. One of the obstacles in Germany are the politicians, Angela Merkel, and also, unfortunately, a bit the Social Democratic Finance Minister Olaf Scholz. So what we did here is, and I'm presenting some preliminary work from our institute on the cost of such a new Green New Deal. Parts of that will be also in this common study. So we basically looked into a number of other studies, tried to make a list what needs to be done, put a number on each of the items. And for decarbonization, we took one of the studies which is very detailed on sector-wise requirements. There are several of these studies. They usually come to costs for basically complete decarbonization by 2050 of 1,700 billion euros. Well, if you distribute that over the years, you find out that it's roughly 1.3% of GDP each year. And we calculated that the public sector has to finance 35% of it, because a lot of that can also be done by, or has to be done by the private sector, by the industries which move into a carbon-free production and the landlords who own the housing. Of course, there's a large level of uncertainty, but we think we had a number of workshops now, internal workshops, and I think the numbers are about right. This is now very small. I don't want to go through that all, but what you see here, these are the interesting figures. If you do this, and I mean this includes like closing all the infrastructure needs which have run up over the past years, improvement in local public transport, early child education in order to increase the participation rate of women in the labor market, housing construction, increasing public housing, broadband train system, and so on. And down here, decarbonization. Over 10 years, the government would be 170 billion, would have to pay 170 billion for decarbonization. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude, German GDP is about 3,500 billion. So this here is then roughly, well, this whole thing is the 1.3 I was talking about before. So if you take all this together for the public sector, this would add up to additional investment spending of roughly 700 billion over the coming 10 years. You see what we did with the trade unions and the employers is a bit less than that. But, well, I think it's a good start for the public debate. And that here would be roughly 2% of GDP. So how can we finance that? As Peter said, debt financing would be appropriate. It would make complete sense. We now have negative nominal interest rates in all maturities on German public debt. So we can borrow at 30 years with negative nominal interest rates. The German debt level is not overly high. And in addition, large parts of the benefits for these investments accrue to future generations. Germany has a special situation different from the US. If we decarbonize and produce our energy at home, we don't have the import bill because we import most of our energy. So that really means the generations in the future, even if there is some public debt, they don't have to pay this import bill anymore. And what we did here, or what I did here, is to simulate the debt to GDP level if we would assume that these roughly 2% of GDP were entirely financed by additional debt. And the blue line you see is, the path of public debt which would happen if no additional debt is taken up. And the orange line is what happens if you take this, if you finance all these 700 billion over the 10 years. The interesting thing is that Germany would remain under the threshold of 60% of GDP, which is in the Maastricht Treaty. So no matter whether we now discuss MMT or whatever, we can easily do that in the system as we have it. And I think this is an important argument to win over the more conservative parts of our society. By the way, these are quite conservative assumptions. I have calculated with a real GDP growth of 1.2% per year, inflation of 1.8%, and interest rate on newly emitted government bonds of 0.5%, which is way above what we are having at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to end here. I think even though a bit of time is still left. This comprehensive New Deal would cost roughly 2% of GDP each year. That can be easily financed for Germany. And at the moment, I'm a bit hopeful that there are shifting political majorities and that we can, we won't get the whole package, but that we can move into that to modernize our economy. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Damon Silver. I'm the policy director of the AFL-CIO. Since we have a global audience here, the AFL-CIO is the American trade union central body. We represent 12 million American workers and about 4 million retirees. The president of the AFL-CIO is, after the president of the United States, the person elected by the most adult Americans to a position of power in this country. So there's been a lot of talk about the labor movement today. So this is, for those of you who were interested in that, I kind of speak for the labor movement. And what I'm going to say is going to be consistent with AFL-CIO policy, but it will have a certain personal tinge to it. So just take that for what it's worth. Let me begin, because I think some people misunderstand some things that people in the labor movement say when we're talking about climate, by saying that I think that and the president of the AFL-CIO has said this in a number of forums, I think that climate change is an existential threat on the order of, say, the kind of threat that fascism represented during the Second World War. I think that you really have to understand things about the history, about geology and paleontology and various other somewhat technical things to understand just quite what a threat it is. We really don't know how rapidly it will become a true existential threat, but the worst case scenarios are very, very bad, right? They represent potentially, like, for example, we could find ourselves, our children or grandchildren could find themselves on a planet that could not feed the number of people we currently feed every day in the world. Or, for example, the absolute worst case scenario would look something like the Permian extinction. And if you Google that, you will see it's very bad. All right? And so let's just start with the notion that this is extremely serious business. And therefore, we can't afford the sorts of illusions, the political illusions, and in some degrees and the economic illusions that many people of great goodwill insist on. And so I'm going to so remember that as I come around. So this conference is about New Deals. And I think it's important to begin by talking about what do we mean by a New Deal? And what would a contemporary New Deal look like? And this morning, and I just want to reemphasize this morning we heard about the original New Deal as a comprehensive program for essentially the renovation of a nation. A program that addressed technological modernization, public investment, and also democratization. And the first person who spoke this morning talked about the New Deal as a paradigm shift. Now, I think it's really, when you hear people talk about the Green New Deal, what they are doing is summoning a vision of something really comprehensive, socially, economically, technologically, politically. It's a vision that goes beyond climate. Right? And I think that's important because it's the only way. It's the only way of effectively addressing climate change. And this type of social renovation underlay the success of the United States in the 20th century. The fact that we were able to do it through democratic means, unlike major powers in Europe, which either turned to authoritarian and totalitarian methods or failed to do it, as France and England essentially failed to do in the run-up to World War II. That's critical to understanding who we are as a nation. Now, what do I mean by you can't calculate using, for example, multipliers, what the positive impact of doing this kind of thing right is. And let me just give you a little example. I wrote an article in 2008 during the financial crisis thinking about the failure of private sector, of household debt as a way of maintaining growth. And I suggested in that article that what we ought to be looking at is essentially a Green New Deal, that what we ought to be thinking about is putting the United States at the front of the technologies necessary to address climate change. And the first thing I started with was high-speed rail. At the time that I wrote that article, neither the United States nor China had any high-speed rail. In 2008, both the American and the Chinese governments committed to developing high-speed rail. I think you all know that today, the United States does not have any high-speed rail. China, on the other hand, has a high-speed rail network that carries more passenger miles than the American domestic airline system. But that's not the important fact. The important fact is that now China is the provider of high-speed rail technology and construction solutions to the world. To Ethiopia, for example. To California. When we talk about whether we have a successful Green New Deal or not, those are the economic, social, and political stakes. All right, now, what are the three core things that a New Deal did, our New Deal did, and that a future New Deal would need to do, whether in this country or elsewhere? The first is fix labor markets with their associated tax and social security structures. Two is public investment, and we just heard a very nice presentation from our German colleague about what that looks like in Germany. I will tell you, by the way, that in a paper that I did for the Roosevelt Institute, it's about the same numbers in the United States, 2% of GDP over 10 to 15 years would not only fix our infrastructure, but essentially accomplish the decarbonizing of our economy. This is easily done with political will. And third, the third characterization is democratization, is essentially undoing structures of oligarchy in our politics and our economics. And this starts with the labor market and workers having voice. That is a description both of the New Deal of the 1930s and of the present urgent agenda. Now, I think if you look across the major developed countries, France, I'm not going to comment on Japan because I don't feel like I'm knowledgeable enough about it, but I've just spent a fair amount of time looking at France, Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And we've had some references to the Yellow Vest today, and to the fact that the Germans have just negotiated a shutdown plan for their coal industry. If you look across these countries, what you will see is there's a direct connection between how well labor markets function, how much voice working people have in both economics and politics, and the ability of states to make decisions around climate change that stick. And in fact, there is a correlation between union density in OECD countries and the carbon intensivity of their economies. The higher the union density, the lower the carbon intensivity. And it's a rather strong correlation. And that tells you something deep about the ability of societies where there's a rough balance of power to be able to address the kind of embedded economic and political forces that are leading us down a path to catastrophe in climate. Now, the Green New Deal, which is a phrase that originates in the United States, is a great phrase because it summons, unlike just transition, I mean, the labor movement thought up just transition, so I'm not blaming anybody. But there are important communities in the United States where when you say somebody has transitioned, right, what you're saying is that they've died. This is not lost on working people. Green New Deal, on the other hand, summons a sense of optimism and a sense of fairness and a sense of progress that is invaluable here. It's our myth. right, in a good way. I don't mean it's a fake. I mean, it's our story about the greatness of our country. So then why has it become, in effect, if we're honest, why has it become a kind of political albatross? Right? Why is it now seen as a slogan of, as John put it, the socially isolated left? And the reasons for this are, first, that it was originally sort of thought up by folks whose real core agenda was to immediately stop all carbon fuel production. It was sort of tacked on to how do we get people to focus on this really aggressive idea. And as a result, it wasn't fully developed enough when it was initially rolled out in terms of what in terms of what people were talking about around investment. And thirdly, its advocates got, I would say, somewhat entangled in some rather complex and vicious internal infighting in the Democratic Party. And the result is it has become seen as the opposite of practical. If the original New Deal was seen as practical public policy making, the idea of the Green New Deal has now become associated in many people's minds with the opposite. Now, so what do we need to do? Because let me tell you, a public policy idea that is embraced by a subset of the Democratic Party and a potentially socially and politically isolated one, as John Judas said, that idea is not going to go anywhere. So there's some fundamental changes that need to be made. The first one is that it needs to be associated in the minds of the public with an agenda that really puts labor policy first, that reconnects wages with productivity, that restores a sense of economic security among working people, and most of all, that gives voice. Because, for example, I can tell you in Germany, when the coal shutdown agreement was negotiated, the German government knew exactly who to put in the room who represented coal miners. Let me ask you, does anyone in this room know, if you were going to have a discussion about transition, who would you go talk to in Beaumont, Texas? Who would represent the people whose lives would be potentially devastated by shutting down the oil industry? In a society where the labor movement has been as weakened as it is in the United States, who do you talk to? So that's one. Two, we have to stop using the climate fight as a proxy for a fight about modernity. Many people are unhappy with modernity. But for most people in modern society, particularly people with memories and old relatives, modernity is a damn sight better than the alternative. A concrete example of this is, consider the fact that there is no hybrid pickup truck. The pickup truck, for a lot of people in this country, symbolizes the fact that you don't have to do hard physical labor out in the elements, and that you don't have to use your muscle to do it. If there are not going to be pickup trucks in the future, for people who do physical work, it looks like a pretty grim future. Finally, we have to be practical from an engineering and a political perspective. I respectfully want to submit to you that until we are prepared to indulge the idea that the policy preferences of those who would like carbon capture invested in, who would like nuclear invested in, who would like hydrogen invested in, it will be impossible to make any political deal in our lifetime in the United States that will actually take on climate change. That is the price of winning this war. And if that sounds like really tough to you, consider the following anecdote. When Hitler invaded Russia, somebody asked Winston Churchill, whose side are you on? Winston Churchill had spent his entire life fighting communism. And Churchill said, well, he said, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. It is in that spirit, and only in that spirit, that it will be possible to head off the very profound existential threat that climate change represents to our civilization. Thank you.
All right, as chair, I'm going to take my prerogative to just have a question and a comment and a challenge to the presenters, and really to everybody here. I want to ask everybody, how does racial justice figure into these social movements? There's been no mention of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's been no mention of the fact that when we think about the labor movement historically and the New Deal was two-tiered liberalism. It was liberalism for whites and liberalism for blacks. Black people got public housing projects, and white people got the biggest wealth redistribution after racial slavery in the form of housing in the FHA. When we think about where we're at now, what we call the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and anti-apartheid movements, those were labor movements. But labor was segmented because of the politics and practices of white supremacy. The Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives that erupted in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin's murder in 2012 and Michael Brown's murder in 2014 and the deaths of Sandra Bland and Corinne Gaines, these are labor movements. These are universal movements that are looking at the particular experiences of Black, Latinx, women, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender American citizens and immigrants. So when we think about a labor movement and a Green New Deal, we are never going to get a Green New Deal unless we have racial justice and intersectional justice, what Kimberly Crenshaw has called intersectional justice, but the first people to call it that were Black women in the 18th and 19th century who were radical and revolutionary Black feminists who were talking about universality, but they were talking about universality in Black. And they were challenging white men, white women, white feminism, white mainstream movements to think about the bitter fruits of white supremacy historically from racial slavery to the present and globally, not just domestically. So where does racial justice, where does intersectional justice, where does Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community fit into these new social movements? Because without that, without all of us understanding that the only way we can be free is if all of us are free, and if we put those who have been at the margins at the center of our discourse, our research, our empathy, our public intellectual and our organizing energies and ability. Otherwise, we are trapped in a dichotomy of an old left that's white and wheezing and on its way out, that doesn't want to admit that people of color in this country are being exploited, are being dehumanized, are being demonized, whether they're in ICE detention camps or whether they're in Travis County Jail right here in Austin, Texas. This is incredible that we're not talking about racial justice at the core and the center of these new social movements. That's the only way we can be liberated, and I challenge everyone here to talk to me about racial justice and intersectional justice, please.
I'm supposed to be first here?
Damon wants to, and John, you go right.
Okay, I'll go right ahead. And I'll say something unpopular and then let other people go. Look, I was...
I said Damon. Yeah,
so,
then you're
that's
yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I really welcome that intervention because in a 10-minute thing where one takes notes, one tends to forget stuff,
Yeah.
right? And we were challenged by an earlier speaker, I think, who was trying to make the same point as you just made, about where does justice fit into this? And I think that we have to really begin by recognizing that the enormous wealth and prosperity that was created by the carbon fuel economy was was organized on racial lines,
Yeah.
right? And so now we're going to try to fix it, right? Does that mean that a future America that is going to be, and I hate this phrase, but I don't know a better one, a majority-minority America is going to pay the price of the big party that the white people had, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to, I'm going to answer this with a story rather than with an attempt to be analytic. So people know that Mike Bloomberg has declared for the presidency.
Yep.
And this is a fact, right?
Sort of.
Let me declare is the right word. He's filed some papers that suggest that he might like to run for president. And let me tell you two things about Mike Bloomberg that, in a way, perhaps are a guidepost to the challenge you posed to us. This morning in the New York Times, Charles Blow, a columnist, wrote about the fact that Mike Bloomberg was the man who authorized, designed, and profited politically from the systematic racial profiling of youth of color in New York City and the use of the police to essentially persecute folks, right, in the stop and frisk program. And Charles Blow ended by saying, like, I won't even speak to you if you vote for Mike Bloomberg because of what he did to communities of color in New York, that he created a police state that white people didn't notice. And let me tell you something else about Mike Bloomberg. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world. He's worth about $38 billion. And he cares a lot about climate change. Now, he did a lot of natural gas investing, but he says he cares a lot about climate change. He gave $50 million. He gave $50 million to environmental groups in the aftermath of the Democrats' defeat in 2010, when it was unclear where the climate fight was going to go. He gave $50 million to environmental groups to push a close coal campaign. Now, the truth is that there are way, way more retired coal miners than there are actives. And there is between $5 and $10 billion missing from those retired coal miners' health and pension plans. Now, I just told you what Mike Bloomberg's personal net worth is. 7 times that amount. But he essentially pushed a program that sought to shut the coal industry with no regard for what was going to happen to those people. His idea was, let's make retired coal miners bear the cost of fighting climate change. And the predictable result was that the coal communities became rather hostile to everyone associated with him. Now, I don't see how any of that constitutes justice. Right? And these are two, being a retired coal miner, and what that's like, what coal mining does to people. Right? Now, you take those two stories, and they are stories about the nature of the way America works today. And my answer to your question is the challenge is how to knit those stories together into some kind of effective politics. Because as long as those two stories are separate and not even heard by the people experiencing them, then we're stuck. We're not going to have the cohesion and the strength to challenge the kind of political power that having $37 billion in the hands of one man means.
Thank you. Unpopular. You said it's going to be unpopular.
Yeah, and I'm not going to talk about climate change either, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Ralph Northam. He's the governor of Virginia. And I just want to make an odd maybe point, but it fits with what I was trying to say about the left. He was a right-wing site who objected to his position on abortion, published this old 1983 yearbook with a picture on his page of Ku Klux Klan guy and somebody else. I can't remember what the other was. The other was in blackface. It was something
yes.
like that. And as sometimes happens with now in consultants, he immediately said, "Oh, yes, I'm sorry, it was me." But as it turned out, he wasn't sure, and it remains completely up in the air. Now, the immediate response of the Democratic candidates, and I think this again fits something that's happened to the left, was the guy should resign. He's out of office, even though in the succeeding whatever 17 plus 19 years as a person and a public official, he had not done anything that was particularly racist, nothing that displayed attitudes towards the Klan. There was something hysterical, I thought, about the reaction. And then the Washington Post did a poll in Virginia, and it turned out that the black citizens in Virginia, a majority of them thought he shouldn't resign. I attributed that partly to a Christian spirit of forgiveness, because he apologized. It did happen in the past, and thing, but also to a political realism about a sense of proportion, about how we go about building majorities and how we go about building a majority in our country that will satisfy a whole different range of people. What that means to me is that, yes, racial justice, what's happening in prisons, what's happening in particular towns, police forces should be an absolute concern. But what concerns me, and again, this just goes back to what I'm talking about in my little talk here, is that there's, again, a kind of quasi-religious sense that this has to be the single most overriding issue. And what I'd say about this, I said this at a talk where I was one of there were three black activists and me. And I said, well, if you make that your single greatest concern for the Democratic Party, the Republicans are going to be in power for the rest of the century, and blacks in America are going to get totally screwed. So that's my unpopular response. I don't know. That doesn't say to all things you were talking about, but that's the part of it that I would respond.
Can I?
Sure. Yeah.
I do think, as we heard in the last panel, that a Green New Deal has to do a great deal of mitigation and aid to what are called frontline communities. And yes, my old hometown of Los Angeles, if you lived in South Central, if you live in Wilmington, where the oil refineries are, if you lived in the Bay Area in Richmond, where the oil refineries are, that is a minority population, that is a poor population. The air quality is dangerous. Cases of asthma go up, life expectancy goes down. That's a reality of race and class, which then is reflected in the disparity simply in lifespans, which is a huge factor. So any concept of a Green New Deal has to give specific aid and remediation to those communities. Then, when you talk about the workers impacted, some of whom are in, unions which are, as Damon has said, their take on the Green New Deal has been colored by actors like Mike Bloomberg. Some of those unions are heavily minority. Laborers are heavily Latino movement. A lot of construction work in major American cities is done by Latinos. Some of the leadership of trade unions in the building trades doesn't reflect that yet. Some of it reflects an older constituency that harbored white biases common at all economic strata of America. Sometimes it reflects it, sometimes it doesn't. Some of the building trades leaders who were very good on immigration rights, nonetheless fearing that their white members are voting for Trump or have occasionally waffled on that. Those are real issues. Those are real issues. But look, in many ways, the working class of the United States, as it has always been, is heavily immigrant, is heavily minority, and the policies of the Green New Deal going forward have to recognize that, have to recognize their importance of having workers at the table as these are worked out, but also of the specific burdens that minority communities have faced in terms of the remediation that a Green New Deal must do.
I think it's becoming more and more common to talk about these issues, whether it's economic inequality or gender equality or racial inequality, in terms of their common roots. They look like they are isolated or independent single issues, but more and more I think I read that they have the common roots of the very powerful 1%. It's at the bottom of all these problems. The 1% in cooperation with media and experts, think tanks, they can target every single issue you can think of. So, of course, we need to have individual discourses on individual issues. injustice need to be addressed, but it's really very, very important to target the 1%, the neoliberal discourse, the manipulation, and a lot of PR works.
Thank you.
Well, I noticed that among the listeners, there were a number of people who would like to say something, maybe not necessarily minorities, but young women, for example, and maybe I give them my time and you can call
Oh, sure,
some of them.
sure. Let's do it. We're over time and we're going to end soon, but.
So I've actually thought about this a lot, about the issue that you just brought up. And the way I think about it is, before I always thought about it like, the world's going to end. That's obviously our biggest issue.
Yeah.
But the only way to stop that is if everybody comes together in some way. And to do that, we have to get rid of these biases that we have. And so I've thought about it, and I'm like, I've done the gun marches, I've marched for women's rights, I've marched for climate change and gone on a climate strike with her. And all of these things I feel like are just activism. But they're all connected in some way or another. And so we had a speaker earlier who talked about how minorities, blacks, Latinxes, are in areas where they drop off chemicals that are destroying their lives and all those different things. And so I think it all does connect in some way or another. But a lot of people put the climate crisis over the other ones because they're like, it's going to end the world. But I do agree with you that everything has to come together for it to stop.
Yeah, and the only thing I'm premising this on, and I think people's hearts are in the right place, but we have to get our rhetoric and our organizing behind this, is that, of course, environmental justice is racial justice. Gender justice is racial justice. Class justice, LGBTQ. These things are, I don't think they're the rarefied articulations of the elite. This is how people are actually living their lives globally, right? And so my mom, Haitian immigrant, part of SEIU for 40 years, I was on my first picket line at 8 years old in New York City. I've been around the table in both polite conversation with union, multiracial activists, and screaming matches with them growing up over what did justice actually constitute? What did it mean? And if you did justice for women, for instance, in a union, was that a set-aside? Was that special treatment? Or were you trying to just get women justice who had been oppressed for centuries? I always chose the latter, that no, you were just trying to get women justice. Saying that a woman could be a shop steward wasn't special treatment. She always should have been allowed to be a shop steward, right? Or if somebody was Haitian or if somebody was non-able-bodied, right? But unless we say that this is the core of who we are and we're proud, and I disagree respectfully with the idea that if we say that this is who we are, we're going to lose elections. I think the most heartening thing of the Barack Obama election in 2008 and the re-election in 2012 was the fact that it was a multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational coalition. And I also disagree that it's only young people who are part of these new social movements. I think that there are long marchers, including people on this panel, who are part of it, but they've also, at least the best of them, have learned from these young people in the way in which young people are actually theorizing and organizing around their own lives. This has been Black, Latinx, white activists too, intergenerationally learning that, hey, maybe what I thought, whether it was historical materialism, whether it was whatever theory of change I had, these young people are disrupting the status quo for me. And that's happened to me too, and it always happens. So I just think if we have the courage of our convictions, and again, I go back to Dr. King. Dr. King is a revolutionary. His notion of a beloved community was a notion where we were gonna end racial privilege and we were gonna have radical citizenship for all of us, including guaranteed income, healthcare, a whole gamut. And unless we lead with that, that's the lead. I think the panel, and that's what I was challenging people, our lead is these new social movements, and this New Deal is going to be connecting the sacred documents of the Founding Fathers and Declaration of Independence to a new reality. That's what King talked about, right? That's what King, and that's what, we're at the LBJ school. LBJ, in his finest moments as president, leads us into this beloved community, right? And so that's what this time demands. So I always want to hear about not just even racial justice, intersectional justice. I want women in the lead. I want black people and Latinx. And I think we've got to stop using the term minority. We can say people of color, but we are a global majority. The only minority globally are white people. That's what's happening. And unless we understand that, not in a way that makes us sad, but in a way that makes us understand that whiteness has meant property and inordinate privilege and power to exploit and to gather wealth and exploit other bodies historically in terms of Western civilization. Unless we can push back against that, including our allies, our putative assumed allies, and we're not talking about political revenge or a reckoning, we're actually talking about justice that can liberate all of us. That's why Dr. King was leading the Poor People's Campaign. No guns, no knives, no curse words. He wanted redistributive justice in the spring of 1968. And that's the same year Jamie and Harold were at the DNC. That's what King wanted, and I think I want people to still want that and see how intersectionality, right? And again, saying racial justice is at the center of these new deals. That's what's going to save us all.
There's another, yeah. There's another point that I had that I've been also thinking about. Sorry,
You'll close. This is the last. You'll close this out. You're closing this out.
Okay.
Yes.
But I've thought about this a lot, and I think everyone needs to know who they are before they can help everyone else. And so, like, for me personally, like, I've gone, like, first of all, I'm a woman, and so I have to go through those different things. I'm part of the queer community, so I have to go through those different things.
Can you tell us your name, please?
My name's Roma.
Roma, are you an undergrad, grad?
I'm actually 14 years old.
Oh gosh, I hope that you come to UT and become one of our students. I mean, you're incredible. I mean, whoa. I mean, this is awesome. This is awesome.
But so I feel like everyone needs to be accepted before anything else can happen with our climate. So I think that is at the core of everything. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Well, thank you. We're out of time.
I wanted to say something.
We're gonna end it on a good note. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
We could have argued for another half hour.
I just have a quick word and a logistical announcement or two. The word is, of course, that the discussion has evolved and covered the range of issues from the historical to the technical, and to wind up in this very moving and effective way on the question of social and political. This is an artifact of design, I want you to know. It was not something that happened by accident. But I also want to, if you permit, a slight anecdote, since Harold, it's been mentioned twice that Harold and I intersected for the first time in Chicago in August of 1968. He was on the 15th floor of the Hilton Hotel. I was on the 14th. The anecdote I have to relate concerns whether it's really possible to bring together in some final moment of comedy and mutual understanding these widely divided forces. It was the morning after the police violence in Grant Park, which occurred on Thursday. On Friday morning, my father went down to talk to the protesters in the park. They were sitting there. They'd been rather badly beaten up the night before. And they were ringed by a cordon of armed National Guard who had their weapons out, or at least at the ready. And my father looked out to the crowd and he said, I don't want you trying conclusions with those young men over there. They're draft dodgers just like you. And as he finished this remark and came down, he saw a young sergeant from the National Guard walk up to him, and he thought to himself, Galbraith, perhaps you've gone a little too far. And the young man stuck his hand out and said, Professor, I just want to shake your hand. That's the nicest thing anybody has said about us all day. So on that merry note, I just have to say thank you, everybody, for a really remarkable day of discussions. And we will resume tomorrow. And thank you once again.